Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here with such a distinguished panel to talk about the Middle East today. 4 years ago, in 2011, just a few months into the Arab revolutions, I was at a conference in Washington where I heard a Saudi prince declare, "I don't call this the Arab Spring, I call it Arab turmoil." The Saudis were never keen on the uprisings, so this wasn't a surprise. But now, 4 years on, there are many people who think that the Middle East is a chaotic, hopeless place, and one where kings and caliphs seem to rule the roost. Yet, the questions to be resolved are so many: secular versus Islamist, left versus right, nation versus sect versus tribe, that these cannot possibly be resolved by diktat from above. The Arab Spring has changed things. A young journalist I met in Tunis described it to me best. She said, "We've been homogenized into blocks for the last 60 years of dictatorship. And now a Pandora's box has been opened, and there's no option but to work through history." In today's Middle East, the past is unfinished, and the future remains uncertain. And to explore this, the past, present, and future, I have a stellar panel here with me today. Kai is the author of Crossing Mandelbaum Gate, Coming of Age Between the Arabs and Israelis, 1956 to 78, and has just started work on a biography of President Carter. Simon is the author of Jerusalem, an absolutely majestic biography of the city, which Bill Clinton chose as his book of the year. William is the author from the Holy Mountain, A Journey Among the Christians of the Middle East, another extraordinary book, particularly interesting today when the religious mosaic of the Middle East is changing. William, Simon, and Kai are all historians, so I'd like to actually just kick off the discussion by asking, is the Middle East actually stuck between history and hope? Who would like to go first?
Well, yes, it is stuck. When I was growing up in the Middle East as a child, in Jerusalem, Beirut, and Cairo, and Saudi Arabia, this was the heyday of Arab nationalism, of Nasser. And every young Arab woman and man aspired to learn about the modern world, about technology, about engineering. They wanted to be engineers. They wanted to be part of modernity and secularism and Arab nationalism, which was defeated. And that, of course, opened the door eventually, defeat after defeat, to religion, I think. But I do have hope for my childhood home, and maybe it's a naive hope, but when I was on my way to the Jaipur Literary Festival last January, I was on a plane from Bombay to Jaipur. It was very crowded. A whole, 20 Saudi women boarded all at once in Porta. I was assigned to a seat next to one, and of course this was not going to work, and she immediately got up, and a young man sat next to me instead, who is a Saudi, who is a medical student. And he opened his iPhone and he started querying me about my music, what was on my iPhone. And I said, well, I like you too, thinking that would be a hip answer, but he said, oh, that's so passé. He was into hip hop. He was into, American culture in a way that was just astonishing. So I think, the forces of secularism and rationality and modernity are still there, but they are being overwhelmed by a reactionary history and our own endless wars.
On the idea of secularism, I'd love William to actually pick up on that, because of the mass exodus of Christians from the Middle East. How fundamental is Arab Christianity to the idea of Arab secularism?
I think one of the big surprises for people who don't know their Middle Eastern history is how very strong the minorities were in the Levant at the beginning of the 20th century. As late as the as the immediate pre-First World War period, a quarter of the population of the Levant, the coastal Middle East, was Christian, and there were other large minorities of the Jews, Yazidis, a whole spread of different Druze, all these different minority faiths. And the way that has unraveled in 100 years, the way that minorities have everywhere fled to places that they can be majorities, the Jews to Israel, the Armenians from across the coast to Armenia, all these different groups, the Egyptians throwing out minorities and creating a strong Egyptian and often Upper Egyptian identity where there had been none in places like Alexandria. The way that this incredibly closely woven fabric of different faiths, ethnicities, and groups has given way to strong national identities in the course of the mid-20th century. And the way that is now unraveling a second time, it's not clear where it's going. The two, it seems, strong strands of identity that are reasserting themselves as national borders crumble. This seems to be happening, for example, between Syria and Iraq at the moment, is, of course, the tribe. One of our most fantastic Middle Eastern sessions at the Jaipur Festival was last year was Charles Glass, who wrote this great book, Tribes with Flags, and the reassertion of tribal identity. And if you look into the advance of ISIS through Iraq and Syria, it's often been on a tribal basis. They go from one tribe to the next, and a tribe takes on the Islamic State or not. But then also, this seems to be a kind of reversion to the 19th and pre-modern Ottoman system of the millet system, whereby religious identity, which was often suppressed to a certain extent in the days of Arab nationalism, has reasserted itself. So in the 1960s and 1970s, you had very strong Christian presence in the Ba'ath parties, both in Syria and Iraq. Saddam Hussein's foreign minister, Tariq Aziz, was, for example, a Syrian Christian who once surprised Donald Rumsfeld by breaking into onward Christian soldiers in Aramaic, the language of Christ. And I think Westerners were often taken aback by how much in those Arab secular regimes Christians had a role, and indeed that the Ba'ath Party was founded by Michel Aflaq, who was certainly born a Christian. And that Christian minority that helped form the identity of Arab nationalism by clinging to the idea of the nation state and beyond that a greater pan-Arab identity, has lost ground in the most unimaginable fashion throughout the second half of the 20th century. As many as a quarter of the population of Iraq under Saddam Hussein was Christian, and within 5 years of the American or Anglo-US invasion of Iraq, 2/3 of that Christian minority had been driven out, many of them to Syria. And going around Syria a decade ago, one would pass these huge displaced Christian Iraqi population sitting around in the parks, playing with worry beads or sitting in cafes without anything to do, often being supported by the Suryani church in Damascus, been given living space. Now that Syrian Christian minority have been driven out too. Whole communities have been uprooted. The Armenian Christian community, who I stayed with on several trips in Armenia, a little self-contained enclave within the middle of Aleppo, Armenian speaking, with Armenian clubs and Armenian churches, gone entirely, all gone to Yerevan. Entire exodus of that community no longer exists. It was there since at least the 3rd century, and it is there no longer. And where this is going is very difficult to say, but I don't feel terribly hopeful. I think that in a sense the confused Saudi teenager with the mum or sisters in Purdah listening to hip-hop is almost a symbol of the kind of muddle of this sort of broken, incomplete modernity that we have in the Middle East, which has led to a widespread appreciation of hip-hop while not bringing with it the social changes or the social identities or the social infrastructure which creates that sort of music.
Yeah, the strangest thing about sort of the culture and technical advantage of the digital age in the Arab world, you know, such as the you know, YouTube did, you know, is that it hasn't brought any progress. I mean, it's brought progress for some people, but it hasn't. But it's also proved a brilliant weapon for ISIS and for Al Qaeda and so on.
Beheading videos
and stuff, which is so many of the things that we presumed, and we all presumed at the beginning of all this that technology was progress in the Arab world, and we presumed it was progress in our own country. It hasn't necessarily been progress in the West either, with trolling and all sorts of other sort of appalling things. Just to go back to the sort of idea of sort of hope or history, I don't see it as an either or. I always have hope for human affairs because wars do end historically, even if they go on for centuries. This one might well go on for centuries. This is what we're seeing now, looking at it as a historian in a wider sense. Is, of course, there was Nasserism, there was nationalism, and in which, you know, many causes in the Arab world, including the Palestinians, were also completely designed and driven by Christian Palestinians, for example. One has to realise
the Arab awakening.
The Arab awakening was the Christian. I think the Christian. I think the Christians are the huge. I mean, the Christians are the huge tragedy of what's happening today. But I think, you know, if you look at different parts, if you look at what we regard as sort of fait accompli, things we understand. For example, you know, Nasserism was all about you know, Arab pride in a single nation. Well, that was actually run by dictators who were extremely good at managing tribal loyalties in their own countries and making those countries work as best they could, at the same time as being great Arab nationalists. They were also great Arab particularists, if you like, or localists. And it was their removal by America or by their own people that exposed all these terrible fissures and have led to what we're seeing today. But I think the interesting thing what's happening in a different way, of course this is one of the greatest tragedies of the world today. More interestingly is, in some ways, Western powers have actually withdrawn in many directions at the moment. I mean, America, that has dominated and been blamed for virtually everything that's gone wrong in the Arab world since the war, and everything that happened in the Arab world before the war was blamed on Britain and France, and everything that after is being blamed on America, some of it rightly, some of it wrongly. But the fact is, ultimately now, the Arab world, at first in tragedy and blood in a terrible way, but maybe ultimately something will emerge from this, and this is the hope, that is actually created by the Arab peoples for themselves. Some of it will be terrible, some of it won't, or maybe something will emerge out of it that is created by the Arabs for the Arabs, and will therefore be authentic, and therefore be enduring. And that's the hope.
Yeah. I mean, I'd like to pick up on what all of you are saying in terms of, you know, you mentioned George Antonius and Arab nationalism. He was a Palestinian Christian who came up with this idea that seduced an entire generation, including, I believe, Kai's father, to join the State Department and become an Arabist. Yeah. But where are today's Arab intellectuals, and what are the ideas that are driving the Middle East? And I'm not just talking about ISIS. I mean, you know, where is Arab intellectualism today?
It's no accident that Edward Said's last book was entitled In Exile. And increasingly we see, I mean, there's both the intellectual elite, but also tragically now, if you look at Croatia and Macedonia, and these waves of refugees coming out, huge quantities of Arabs are leaving, many driven out by ISIS, and the people who are being driven out are so often the ones that hold the hope for the future. They are the secularists, they are the ones who are educated, who can't stand the ideology of ISIS, and the double tragedy of this exodus at the moment is that these people are in pain and suffering and being bullied by brutal police forces across the Balkans and stopped, electrocuted as they try to get into the Channel Tunnel and all the rest of it. But the great tragedy is that these are the people who had the education, the hope, and who should be standing up to ISIS, and we should be helping standing up to ISIS.
And yet they're going to be ending up in Europe and here and Australia. Yes, it's a great tragedy. If
you look at the story in Afghanistan, it is possible for millions of refugees to return. In the days after 2001, whatever it was, 1 million Afghans returned to Afghanistan. It's not, and these days these things are not irreversible, but for the time being.
Yeah, but in the meantime, where does that leave the Middle East, where on the one hand we've got ISIS, and on the other secularism has returned to become, I mean, it's only dictators who are again promoting it. I mean, with Egypt, for example. Zakiya, would you like to say something on that?
Egypt. Well, you know, we all had enormous hopes for the Arab awakening. I like the term awakening rather than the Arab Spring because of its historical resonance. But it failed, and yet I still believe that what has happened, the reaction, this general Sisi is attempting to sort of step into the boots of Gamal Abdel Nasser. And of course he is no Nasser, and it's not going to survive. And he's creating opposition and violence by the repression. And yet America is standing by him.
It's such an interesting thing. It's such an interesting point you're making because, of course, he's a sort of, you might say he's a throwback. To the sort of leaders that were ruling, after the war, between the war and the Arab Spring, the Mubaraks, the Sadats, the Gaddafis, and so on, the Saddams. But actually, how much one always regards these kind of leaders as kind of hideous children, bastard children of the sort of Soviet bloc and American bloc, and these military leaders were so un-Arab. But were they, in fact? I mean, if you look at Arab culture, if you look at the Mamluks, for example, you look back throughout Arab history, the tradition of the Seljuk sultans who ran things for the caliphs, for example. I mean, you look, there's just a great history.
Soldier elites and slaves.
Soldier elites. I mean, the Arab. Well, this isn't some foreign imposition on the Arab culture. This is essential. These military Arab.
In the case of the Baibars, they were often Circassian, like Baibars themselves.
Exactly. They were often not Arab at all. These ones were released Arabs. So this isn't such an alien, planting. And I think also, America actually, to be fair to America, America was much criticised by neocons for getting rid of Mubarak and betraying Mubarak. When some people said they should have stood by him. I think they were absolutely right to get rid of them. They could have got rid of them a lot earlier.
Right.
But now, out of exhaustion and out of the failure of many other different possibilities, now they have to they are sort of backing Sisi. I wouldn't say they're particularly enthusiastic. And he is an appalling dictator. The things happening in Egypt now are more depressing than anything that's happened in Egypt. In the memory of post-war memory, really. I mean, they are more oppressive now than they ever were under Nasser.
We had at Jaipur last year Adaf Suef, who had lived in England all her adult life and been brought up in Cairo, and she went back to Cairo full of hope in the middle of the Arab Spring. She came to Jaipur in 2005, 2006, full of all the excitement of the overthrow of Mubarak. And last year she was saying how of her family, 5 of her nephews and nieces are now imprisoned. All the ones running the blogs, doing the Twitter, sitting in Tahrir Square, and they're all just behind bars. Some of them getting not life sentences of 10 or 15 years for sending out tweets and this sort of thing. They're desperate. It's awful.
But I mean, I was also sort of filled with sort of optimism and excitement with the Arab awakening, Arab Spring. But I also sort of felt, I don't feel it's over yet.
Actually. Exactly.
I think I live in hope and history, and I think that there are these vast elites, these vast middle classes. Not all of them have moved to the London, Edgware Road in London and the Croatian border. The fact is that one has to look at these things in a much, much longer perspective. But I did write at the time. I was very unpopular for writing this. That actually I thought we weren't in a sort of period of a sort of revolution. We were more like in 1848, when revolution spread like wildfire. Even before internet and telephone, they spread like wildfire across Europe, starting in Naples, going to every country, Vienna, Paris, Madrid, Frankfurt, bringing down dictators all over Europe, and yet within 3 years there'd been a huge backlash, and in every single place there was either a civil war or a new strongman was in power. And of course that's exactly what's happened. But,
Simon, picking up on what you said earlier about creating a space, and the fact that America and Britain are pulling back out of failure. You know, the Iraq War was a disaster, and we're not going in again. The American electorate is not going to stand for sending more American troops to another Middle Eastern war. So what is the implication of that? It means that the internal forces there are going to have to figure these things out without external influence.
Well, but
and this comes back to Iran and the deal and the resurgence of Shia power, and in the irony of that, in fact, the Iranian Shia regime is allied to Hezbollah in Lebanon and to the Assads in Damascus, and they are the resistance against these forces of reactionary barbarism.
But I think that in a way they're four protagonists in the Middle East. They're the people that we've talked about in terms of, and there, you're right, I think that the Arab awakening hasn't disappeared because there is this steady bitter patter of protests continuing, as we've seen in Lebanon. Recently, there have been protests against garbage collection, which has also become a sectarian issue.
You stink.
Yes, you stink, which was much about, it was about you stink, and it meant politics in Lebanon stinks, not just the garbage. And then, of course, they're the Islamists, and then they're the local actors. But all of you just now also mentioned, you know, what's happened, not just the regional players, but actually the powers who are involved, not just the US, but Russia as well. So what's happening there?
Sebag, yes, you're great.
Well, I think just to sort of look at it is of course now what's happened is America and Britain, the great imperial powers, if you like, whom we all kind of loathed, both looked to save the region, and yet loathed it when they did and when they screwed it up so badly. And they certainly did screw it up repeatedly, as we all know. They withdrew finally. And so answered prayers are often one's worst nightmares. Now this has been left to a vicious tooth and claw struggle between Shia Sunni blocs, if you like, between the Saudi Egypt versus Iran, with all sorts of local allies. So one set of blocs with clients has now been replaced with just another. As I said earlier, the good thing out of it is that these are local actors out of the Middle East. It shows how false a concept, in a way, all of our views were, whether patronizing and orientalist or well-intentioned and liberal, but how naive we all were to regard the Middle East at all as a sort of single entity, when in fact it's so many complex power plays, ethnic identities. I mean, it is super complex.
What's going on in Turkey is the perfect example of that.
Or Iraq with the Kurds.
So the Turks seem to have taken the opportunity to use the free-for-all on ISIS just to go after the Kurds again. And now bombing all the Kurdish camps in Syria. It wasn't the people who are really resisting ISIS. The Kurds are being destroyed by the...
wicked cynicism of that, that's absolutely right. It's a brilliant point. I mean, you know, the fate of the Kurds is just a super tragedy. I mean, if any people deserve... I am actually, funny enough, you know, for years, virtually all sort of Western opinion loathed the deals at the end of the World War II, World War I, you know, the Sykes-Picot, and so on, Trianon, all these kind of deals that created the modern force. Now we sort of wonder, you know, how bad were those deals? In fact, I mean, if you speak to a lot of the Syrians leaving the war, they are missing. They're longing for Syria. Yeah. The Syria, which, by the way, as both my fellow would agree, was a complete Western invention, drawn by Western mapmakers, with a mixture of good intention and cynicism and greed and all the other sort of things. In fact,
self-interest.
And in fact, now a lot of us are missing those things. I personally am not, actually. I think a new order will go that may be more realistic, I think it's not the destruction of Iraq. Iraq never worked as a state. I'm not sure Syria worked as a state. And I think that what comes out of it may actually be better. And I have hope that some
Syria, I think, was in a sense the last Ottoman land. And it was everywhere else in the Middle East, you'd had this post-Ottoman unraveling where these different minorities had gone off to become majority. That hadn't happened in Syria.
Yeah.
So in Syria, you had a very sort of nicely broken up majority Sunni, but huge minorities that were able to take them on. The Druze, the Christians.
Can I just say something about Russia? We're in a very interesting time. We're in a very interesting time with the Russia. I mean, I think we could be at the beginning of something completely revolutionary. What most people don't realise is that Russia, throughout the 19th century, the Crimean War was a Russian, at least partly a Russian bid to control not just Istanbul, but the Middle East. The famous Sykes-Picot deal was in fact the Sykes-Picot-Sazonov deal, which gave Russia a vast empire across Anatolia, present-day Turkey, bits of Iraq, bits of the Middle East, and a share of running Jerusalem itself, which was the best deal these Russians had ever got. In the sort of 70s, obviously, the 60s and 70s, Russians were very much present in Syria. The Assad regime was in many ways a sort of client state, so was Gaddafi. I mean, when I was researching my book on Stalin, I remember going to all Stalin's dachas by the Black Sea, none of which had been opened since his death, really. And when I went around, there was an old lady showing me around. She said, "You're the first person to come and look around these things, except for one person." And I immediately started worrying if some horrid rival historian, William Dalrymple or Anthony Beaver, had managed to get in there before me, and my heart was sinking. I was virtually in tears. I said, "Who is this person?" And she said, "Oh, no, he was an Arab, Saddam Hussein." Saddam Hussein was the only other person who insisted on seeing every one of Stalin's houses, which gives you an idea of how he saw himself. And of course, Tikrit is as close to Baghdad as Tbilisi. It's pretty close to Tiflis, where Stalin was born. They're not far apart. So what's happening now is finally a success that the Russians, not Stalin didn't manage, that Catherine the Great didn't manage. Putin has managed it. He is pouring troops into the Middle East, into Syria for the first time. America has withdrawn. As I said, we might have to...
Sebag, I'd like to pick up on that actually and bring Kai in, because the Soviet Union has always had a naval base in Syria and now plans to build an air base. And as you're saying, in fact, the winner of the Syrian war has been Putin, because he's managed to propel Russia sort of back into superpower status out of Syria. But where does that leave America? I mean, what is the American response? Because there really hasn't been one. But maybe you could talk about that. And also,
can I just break in with a story, a Russian and Syria story, just before you tell us that? The most extraordinary example of Syrian the way the different faiths coexisted in Syria was this extraordinary monastery called St. Nile, which had a reputation for giving children to childless couples. And it's founded by Justinian in the 6th century. It's a magnificent monastery with wonderful Byzantine this and that and amazing icons. And you go there in the evening and watch the evening mass. 3/4 of the attendees in the congregation 10 years ago, and I've got this on film, it'll be almost unbelievable to a future generation, were Muslims. And they came because they venerated Our Lady of St. Naya, Mariam being also a figure in Islam, and because they wanted children. And they often made promises that if they had children, that they would give the child for a year to do the kind of domestic work in the kitchens or whatever at the monastery once they reached the age of 16 or 17. So this was a monastery, a Greek Orthodox monastery outside Damascus that was completely filled with Muslims. And I spent a night there. In my guest room, there were these pictures of these two apparently Soviet cosmonauts holding a sheep. So I asked the guest lady who these guys were. They were 2 Syrian astronauts who'd gone up into the Mir space station in the 80s or 70s, and on their successful return to Syria, had brought, both of them were Muslims, but they made a vow to Our Lady of St. Naya. They brought a Muslim. They brought a sheep these two Muslims had brought a sheep to be slaughtered at Nile in their cosmonaut outfits.
So Kai, should America be worried about these?
About the Russians?
Well, about the cosmonauts and the Russians too.
I think the idea of Syrian cosmonauts is worrying.
Well, no, I don't think we should, as Americans. We should let the Russians have the Middle East if they want it. And I actually wrote an essay in The Nation magazine this past spring. The magazine had its 150th anniversary issue, and they wanted me to look back on the Middle East coverage we'd had over the years. And I made an argument for complete disengagement, complete withdrawal. I don't think we should be selling a single arm, no fighter jets, no weapons, no ammunition, to the Saudis, to the Egyptians, to the Israelis, to no one. We should withdraw. We should provide tons of humanitarian assistance to refugees. We should open up our borders to the refugees. We should have a foreign policy like Norway.
But Obama tried that. I mean, you know, there was a pivot to China, and he tried to retract, but it hasn't worked. So
I don't think he's tried complete disengagement. The American policy is very confused and conflicted at the moment. And as you can see from our current presidential debates, it's all based on complete misunderstanding of our ability to influence events there, and a complete misunderstanding of what actually goes on in the Middle East mosaic. And we know nothing, and we have no right to be there, and when we have gone, we have just created more of a mess. And so at this point, our hands are too bloodied, and we should, you know, get out. That's my message.
Well, on 2 points, just one is nothing to do with the Middle East, but they just on your cosmonauts. I mean, this may be an appalling thing to say to an American audience beaming with pride about the Apollo, but I mean, I actually just wonder about all the space programs run by Soviet Union, present-day Russia, America today. I think this whole thing of them being hugely scientifically valuable is complete nonsense. I think we should cut all of them, and the billions saved by these preposterously flying white elephants going up into the skies, abolish the lot and spend it all on refugees and healthcare. You know, I just don't understand why no one has suggested.
On that happy note of cosmonauts and refugees, we're going to actually open up. We've only got 10 minutes left, so we'll open up the floor to questions. I'll start with the lady here. Is there a mic? That question was, can the three of the panelists comment on the role of religious leaders?
I think one thing we can probably agree on is that probably, you know, whenever religious leaders, whenever religious fanatics achieve political power, it's probably a disastrous development in any country of any, and that applies to all nations. I think, can we agree on that?
We agree on that.
I mean, it doesn't get us anywhere, but I think, you know, that's probably the only thing we probably can agree on.
Okay, question over here.
Would the panelists please comment on the failure of the rich Gulf Arab states to accept refugees with a common culture, language, and religion?
It's a scandal.
Yeah. I don't think any of us will be standing up for the Saudi or the UAE monarchy. The way that particularly the Saudis have spread the most intolerant and unpleasant form of Salafi Islam across beyond the Middle East. As someone who lives in Delhi and reports a lot from Pakistan, Pakistan had this incredibly gentle Sufi Islamic, very mixed up with Hinduism and memories of Hindu practice, and the shrine was the center of everything as much as the mosque. and 40 years of intense Saudi spending in Pakistan has ended that, and the creation of all these madrasas, which are like Saruman's fires in the Lord of the Rings, producing these horrible orcs, pouring out the wheels, churning the flames, firing them. And no, I think that why we've been supporting the Saudis and letting the Saudis get away with what they have. Obviously, the simple fact of looking at 9/11, they were all Saudis.
What should we do with Saudi Arabia then?
It's a desperate mess.
What should we do?
I have no solution, but it's certainly not to support them.
Yeah, but I actually...
I do not think they are the allies we want or hope. It seems to me...
do we have any allies we want or hope?
Very few.
The Kurds.
Which brings us actually, we haven't brought up Israel, which brings us to Netanyahu.
Well, we haven't brought up Israel or Iran. Two big
Sebag, tell us about your joyous feelings at Netanyahu's government being elected back into power.
Well, I mean, ask a question. That's not
yes, let's direct to the audience. I think there's a question there.
Good try, good try.
Hi, actually, I'd like you to comment on, it looks like with the Iran deal, there could be a significant change in the dynamics of the Middle East, and I personally know a lot of Iranis, and I think that there's a lot of pressure from the young population for modernity, and they're just bursting at the seams. So I think if change comes, I'm most hopeful that it'll come because of Iran.
I'm very for this deal. I think Iran is an important player. I'm off there next month to go and report and see what's going on. I think it's a very interesting moment. And Iraq is a majority Shia country. And so it isn't like this is an inappropriate intervention by Iran. I think this is a very, very interesting development, and I am very about one of the few hopeful signs at the moment. This opening up of dialogue with Iran, I think, is extremely important.
Right, and if the deal empowers the so-called moderates and liberals inside the regime, there could be a big opening, and the Shia revival across the Middle East could actually be something hopeful. It could bring back modernity.
Well, a little bit. I also think that I also long for a deal with Iran. I just wish, one, that perhaps the deal had been the details of the deal with the number of centrifuges allowed, and the verifications and all the details. I think the details of it actually are weak. If you look at the actual detail, and worrying. But I'm delighted there is a deal. But my other worry is that obviously there needed to be a wider deal for the region with Iran, and of course there's no sign of that. Oh, of course, it would be delightful if this liberates the middle class to liberalize the system. That would be great. Though, of course, deals with China, for example, haven't really liberalized politics in China, and now we're 60, 70 years after the revolution. So, in fact, this may give all sorts of great hope in the streets of Tehran. This may launch all sorts of nightclubs and lovely liberal newspapers and a film industry, and all sorts of wonderful things might happen, which William will discover in the streets of Tehran. But it might not make the blind bit of difference to the regime, to the hardline regime in Iran for many, many more decades. Except there'll be a nuclear power.
Let's go back to the audience because we've got 5 more minutes. Over there at the back.
Thank you. It's really nice to hear from historians. I'm a political scientist that writes about the UN Security Council, and it's pretty depressing to watch what they are doing. So taking the long view perhaps is a better way, but I'm interested in whether you think, now it's clear you don't feel there's a role for America, but whether the UN and the international community in that way can play a role in Syria or Yemen. I mean, right now with the positions of the US and Russia, it's very, very difficult. But if any of that changed, do you see, would that be a good thing, or this idea of an Arab solution would not include the UN?
I'm actually just going to also take the lady in pink because we're running short on time.
Last question on Israel. When I read the title of the panel, I was convinced that you were going to start with that topic right away. Israel and its neighbors fighting it out, duking it out, between hope and despair. Maybe, is there any solution to it? Yet the names hardly come up, though it's a focus of so much attention, especially in Israel's neighbors, as the crux of the problem, the things in the Middle East. So look into your crystal balls and please give me your best predictions.
Let me just answer both those questions in sort of as quickly as I can, and then hand over to all my colleagues. But the first thing is, I mean, you know, if America and Russia withdraw from the region and out of this appalling, and we decide to leave it, this appalling cauldron of slaughter, to find an Arab way, of course we will discover many unpleasant things about what we thought of as the Arab world, such as the fact that this questioner asked about, you know, why haven't the Gulf states haven't received lots of Syrians, because they don't care about their brethren there. They regard themselves as as separate powers without any moral obligations in that area. So that's a revelation about the way, you know, the solidarity within the Arab world. It isn't quite what we Western optimists hoped it would be. But secondly, I mean, if America's withdrawn and Russia becomes the leading power, Russia, who has a complete amoral power policy of supporting the sort of survival of the fittest and only following Russian interests, we will end up greatly missing the years of American hegemony in the Middle East, if that's possible to imagine, because Putin will support exactly who he wishes with no regard whatsoever to humanitarian questions. The third thing about Israel is, again, another sort of revelation of the last 10 years and since the Arab Spring has been that we were always told repeatedly for 30 years that the key to the Middle East, all tension in the Middle East, was the fault of the Israel-Palestine conflict. And we didn't know that was true, so it was never tested. Actually, as it turns out, there were all sorts of other, possibly even more explosive things happening in the Arab, of which, as Kai said, we didn't understand and knew nothing about. The only thing we knew or understood anything about was the Arab-Israeli conflict.
I think that I would disagree with that, Sebag. I think the reason that everyone used to say that solving Israel-Palestine was the key. To me, listening to Arabs speaking about Israel-Palestine, much of it was that it was the issue which brought out Western bias, and in their views showed that we were not a fair moderator in the region or a neutral umpire.
I think we can agree with that, though. I think we can agree. It does show that.
And that was the significance, that our bias towards Israel.
Well, I'm not talking from the Arab. That's
you're quite right. I mean, with this now, this Pandora's box open.
No, but wait. I think what you're making here is a nuanced point, which is absolutely right. What you're saying is that Arab people, for a long time, regarded Israel as an example of Western bias, which is correct. Western historians, commentators, the commentariat, pundits, repeatedly said something different. They said that the whole Middle East could be solved by solving the Israeli-Palestinian crisis, which was a cancer at the center of the Middle East, and all sorts of other things would be corrected. That has now been shown to be complete nonsense. And in fact, many other things, much more complicated things, were happening in the Middle East. The irony, I never thought I'd say this, but at the moment, I'd say that Egypt, a savage dictatorship, Israel, a tenuous, a struggling democracy, which with many faults, is two of the more stable countries in the Middle East at the moment. Whatever you may think of Israel, that is the fact. The Palestinian-Israeli situation
that leaves
is
us
stable.
with a very bleak prospect.
Yeah, well, that actually leaves us with the end. So unless someone has something positive to say.
That's the truth.
Wrapping up here.
That's the truth.
Usually depressing.
That's the truth. Yeah. Crazy, isn't it? But there it is.
Well, there we go. So I think we're wrapping up this session. Perfect.